Her father stood in the street and told a stranger the truth he could not say at home. His daughter was dying. The doctors had counted the months. The town had already started grieving. And this stranger, this quiet mountain man who had not spoken 50 words to anyone in 4 years, listened to every word. Then he picked up his tools, and he rode to find her. Not to save her, not to fix her, just to make sure that before the end came, someone looked at her like she was worth knowing. This channel is where the Old West lives, the love stories, the hard choices, the quiet heroism of ordinary people who chose each other anyway. This story will remind you that the bravest thing a person can do is stay, when leaving would be easier. If that is the kind of story that stays with you, you're in the right place. Like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this one deserve to be heard. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
The handkerchief was ruined, but Nora Ashby had learned a long time ago that some things you simply fold up small and put away, and you do not look at them again until you are somewhere private. She stood at the window of Alderman's Mercantile in Harlan's Crossing, Colorado Territory, and she folded the cloth with the careful precision of someone who had done this many times before. Blood on the inside, clean cotton on the outside. Tuck it into the left pocket, not the right, because the right pocket held the notice from Silas Pruitt's land office, and she did not want those two things touching each other. She straightened her back. She walked to the counter. Behind it, Mrs. Alderman looked up from her ledger and then looked away again with the particular speed of a woman who had seen something she did not know how to respond to. That look. Nora knew that look the way she knew the sound of her own cough. It was the look of a town already rehearsing its grief. She bought the thread she needed. She exchanged the brief pleasantries that were required of her. She did not cough again, which was a small mercy. Outside, the main street of Harlan's Crossing ran east to west and caught the full force of the October wind coming down from the mountains. The town was young and raw, the kind of settlement that had grown up fast around the railroad and was already showing the cracks of that hurried foundation. 3 saloons, 2 churches, 1 doctor who was more reliable in the mornings than the afternoons. A land office that Silas Pruitt had turned into the most important building in the county without anyone quite noticing it happening. Nora walked south toward home. She had gone half a block when the cough took her. Not a small one, not the kind she could manage with a press of cloth and a steadied breath. This one came from deep in her chest, and it bent her forward at the waist, and it lasted long enough that she had to put one hand against the wall of the livery stable to keep herself upright. When it finally released her, she was shaking. Her eyes were watering. The handkerchief in her left hand was worse than before. She straightened. She put the cloth away. There was a man standing 3 feet from her. He was very large, the kind of large that you noticed before you noticed anything else. He had been loading supplies onto a pack horse outside the livery, and he had simply stopped. He was not rushing toward her. He was not calling out for help. He was not doing the thing that people always did, which was the visible flinch followed by the careful rearrangement of the face into something that was meant to look like calm, but always looked like pity instead. He was just watching her. His eyes were gray-blue, the color of the sky in the hour before a storm, and they did not contain pity. They contained something harder to name. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person who had been broken in a public place before and had learned to stand still while it happened. Nora met those eyes. She said, because it was what she always said, "I am all right." The man picked up the sack of flour he had set down and said, without looking at her directly, "Didn't ask." It was the least pitying thing anyone had said to her in 14 months. She did not know what to do with it. He went back to loading his pack horse. She walked the rest of the way home. She did not learn his name until later, when she stopped in front of Ruth Calloway's boarding house to catch her breath, and Ruth came out onto the porch with a cup of tea she had not asked for and told her, in the way Ruth told most things without being asked. That was Callum Bridger. Goes by Cal. Lives up in the mountains, 11 miles north. Comes to town once a month, sometimes less. Doesn't talk much. Nora took the tea. She drank it on the porch steps while the afternoon light went gold over the rooftops. In her right pocket, the notice from Pruitt's land office sat folded into quarters. 30 days to resolve the outstanding property tax arrears on the Ashby lot. She had read it 6 times. She had not told her father. When she got home, her father was awake in his chair by the window, which was a good sign. George Ashby had good days and bad days, and today was somewhere in between. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who spent considerable energy monitoring her face for information she was not volunteering. "You look cold," he said. "I am cold. It is October." "How was town?" "Unremarkable." She put away the thread. She started the supper. She was halfway through the second pot of water when her father said from his chair, "A man came by this morning while you were out. Fixed the fence post on the north side, the one that has been leaning since August. Wouldn't take payment. Said his name was Bridger." Nora set down the pot. The man she had seen on the street had flour on his hands and sawdust on his boots. The fence post had been leaning since August. She had walked past it every day for 8 weeks and had not had the time or the resources to address it. He had been here before she saw him on the street. He had already done the work and left before she came home. He had not waited to be thanked. She went to the window and looked at the fence post. It was straight. It was solid. It had been mended with the particular care of someone who understood what they were doing. She stood there for a long moment. She did not know what it meant. She knew it meant something. That night, after her father was asleep, Nora sat at the small table in the kitchen with her journal open in front of her. It was not a diary. It had never been a diary. It was 14 months of clinical observation, symptoms recorded with dates and times, treatments attempted, and their results. The slow accumulation of evidence that her body was losing the argument she had been making on its behalf since the doctor in Denver had delivered his verdict with the practiced gentleness of a man who delivered verdicts for a living. 18 months, he had said. At the outside. That had been 14 months ago. She turned to a fresh page. She picked up her pen. She meant to write the day's symptoms, the coughing episode on the main street, the blood, the duration. Instead, she found herself writing something else. She wrote, "He does not look at me like I am already gone." She stared at the words for a moment. Then she closed the journal without adding anything more. In her right pocket, the notice from Silas Pruitt sat folded into quarters, still unread to her father, still ticking. 3 days after the fence post, Cal Bridger came back. He did not knock. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the edge of the Ashby property in the early morning with a toolbox and a measuring rope and the look of a man who had already decided what needed doing. George saw him from the bedroom window and called out to Nora, and Nora pulled her coat on over her nightgown and went outside into the cold. The shed roof, she could see even from the porch, was what he was looking at. The east corner had been soft for 2 months. She knew it. She had not known what to do about it. She walked out to where he was standing. "What do you want for the fence post?" she said. Cal looked at her. He was not offended by the directness. He seemed, in fact, to appreciate it in the way that people who prefer things plainly stated appreciate them. "Roof is soft on the east corner," he said. "Another month and you will lose it before the snow." That is not an answer. "I have got time," he said. "I do not have much use for company, but I have got time. Let me do the work. We can settle accounts when it is done." Nora studied him with the same clinical precision she applied to everything. He was perhaps 30. He had the particular stillness of men who had seen a great deal, and had chosen silence as their primary response to it. His clothes were worn but clean. His hands were capable in the way of someone who used them constantly, and had for many years. "You know I am sick," she said. "Town is not quiet about it." "Then you know I am not a good investment." He picked up his measuring rope. "I am not investing," he said. "I am fixing a roof." She went inside and made coffee. She left a cup on the porch railing at 7 in the morning without comment. When she came out an hour later, the cup was empty and Cal was on the shed roof with a level. She went back inside and did not speak to him again until noon, when she brought out a second cup and a plate of cornbread that she set on the porch railing in the same manner as the first. He came down at noon and ate standing up, and did not say anything about the food. She did not say anything about providing it. They ate their separate lunches in the autumn sunlight without conversation, which was, Nora thought, the most comfortable she had been in someone else's presence in a very long time. The unspoken rules established themselves over the first week without discussion. Cal ate at the small table on the porch, not inside. Nora did not ask about his past. He did not ask about her medical situation. He worked from first light to 2 hours before dark and then left. He did not linger. He did not look at her with worry. He treated her with the specific respect of a man who had decided that what she chose to do with her own body was entirely her own business. On the 4th day, the shed roof required 2 people. Nora climbed without being invited, because she had been doing physical work her whole life, and her body, though failing in certain specific ways, still knew how to climb. Cal watched her reach the first rung of the ladder, and made a single assessment, and then he adjusted to work with her instead of around her. They worked in the specific silence of 2 people who were both competent at the same task, and had stopped needing to narrate it. At the end of 4 hours, the east corner was solid. Cal looked at the finished seam. "Good pitch on that," he said. "I know," Nora said. It was the first moment of genuine mutual respect. It did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived with sawdust and sore shoulders and the faint satisfaction of a job done correctly. On the 7th day, a cold front moved through overnight, dropping temperatures 20 degrees between sundown and sunrise. Cal arrived at first light to find Nora already on the roof, having been up since 4 because she knew what standing water under a half-finished surface would do when it froze. He worked without greeting her, falling into the same rhythm. They spent 6 hours in the cold and finished the job. That evening, because it was cold, and her cough was worse than usual, and stopping to go inside would have meant admitting both of those things, Nora did not go inside. She sat on the porch steps. Cal, who should have been leaving, sat down on the porch steps as well. He positioned himself slightly upwind of her. She noticed, a moment later, that this meant his body was blocking the worst of the wind from reaching her. He had not asked permission to do this. He had simply done it. She let him. On the 10th day, Cal was sharpening tools on the porch in the last of the afternoon light, the methodical, repetitive work of a man who needed to keep his hands moving. Nora brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat down on the other end of the steps. After a silence long enough to be comfortable rather than awkward, Cal said without looking up from the blade, "What do you write in that book?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "Medical observations," she said. "Of what?" "Myself." He was quiet. Then, "You are documenting it?" "Someone should." Another silence. Then Cal, still working the blade. "I kept a record during the war. Every position, every sight line, every shot. Thought if I wrote it down I could understand it." "Did it help?" "No." "Me neither," Nora said. "But I keep writing anyway." He looked up from the blade then, not at her directly, at the middle distance in the way of a man recalibrating something internal. She recognized the gesture. She had done it herself many times, when she encountered something that did not fit into the categories she had already established. That night, after he left, Nora opened the journal to a fresh page. She meant to write the day's symptom record. Instead, she found herself writing a question she did not answer. She wrote, "Why is he really here?" She closed the book. She went to bed. Outside, the October wind came down from the mountains and moved through the trees, and the fence post on the north side of the property stood straight and steady in it, the way it had been built to stand. Nora went to town on a Tuesday for thread and stayed longer than she intended. She had stopped in front of Alderman's Mercantile to review her list when Ruth Calloway came out of the boarding house across the street and crossed over with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had decided a conversation was going to happen, whether the other party had planned for it or not. Ruth was 48 years old, twice widowed, and constitutionally incapable of tiptoeing around anything. She sat down on the bench beside Nora without being invited, and looked out at the street in a way that suggested she intended to stay a while. "That Bridger man has been working your roof for 10 days, Ruth said. "He has been working the shed, yes. Man like that does not do 10 days of work for a stranger." "We have an arrangement," Nora said. "He is settling accounts." Ruth made a sound that managed to communicate several things at once without being a word. Long pause. The street moved around them, a wagon loaded with timber. 2 men arguing quietly in front of the assay office. "He came through this town first time about 4 years ago," Ruth said. "Asked me if I knew a family named Ashby. I told him I did not because you were not here yet." She paused. "He came back 6 months later and asked again." Nora went very still. "He never said why," Ruth continued. "Just asked. I always wondered." She stood up. She patted Nora's hand once in the brisk, unsentimental way she did most things and went back inside. Nora sat on the bench for a while after that. The October sun was thin but present, and she tilted her face toward it the way her body had learned to without being instructed. She was thinking about a man who had come to a town looking for a family that had not arrived yet, and come back to look again, and said nothing about any of it. She was thinking about that when Silas Pruitt's voice reached her from 15 feet away. "Miss Ashby? What a fortunate coincidence." Silas Pruitt was 55, immaculately dressed for a man who managed a land office in a frontier town, and unfailingly pleasant. This was the thing about him that Nora had noticed from their first meeting 8 months ago. He was never rude, he never raised his voice. He offered chairs and expressed sympathy and remembered the names of people's fathers and children and asked after them specifically. He was dangerous the way freezing water was dangerous. You did not notice until you were already in it. He walked beside her for half a block, speaking of the weather, the railroad survey, the general promising trajectory of Harlan's Crossing. He mentioned, with apparent casualness, that the 30-day notice was of course entirely standard procedure, and that he was always available for a conversation about terms. He mentioned that the railroad survey had come within 40 yards of the Ashby lot, which he noted as interesting from a purely property value perspective. And then, as they reached the corner where Nora would turn toward home, he said it in the tone of a man noting something mildly curious. "Oh, I did notice that someone has been inquiring about the vacant Sinclair lot. The one adjacent to your property, man named Bridger, probably nothing. Just thought you might like to know." He tipped his hat. He walked on. Nora stood at the corner for a moment. Then she walked home. Cal was finishing for the day when she arrived, packing his tools with the methodical care he applied to everything. She watched him from the porch. He looked up and nodded once in the way that served him as a greeting. She nodded back. She went inside. She did not ask him about the Sinclair lot. Not yet. But the question had been placed in her, with Pruitt's characteristic precision, and she could feel it sitting there under everything else, waiting. That night she did not write symptoms in the journal. She did not write the question she had written the night before either, because that question now had a more complicated shape than it had had then. She sat with the journal open on the blank page for a long time. The lantern burned. The wind moved around the house. From the back bedroom, she could hear her father's careful breathing, the particular rhythm of a man whose heart was working harder than it should have to. She closed the journal without writing anything. She took out the notice from Pruitt's land office and read it again. 23 days remaining. She put it back. She went to bed and lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling, where the lantern light made slow patterns she had memorized over 14 months of nights just like this one. The following morning, she was in the garden when Cal arrived. She watched him assess the north fence line, moving along it with the quiet attention of a man who noticed things. When he reached the post, He had mended on his first visit. He paused. He ran a hand along the wood, checking his own work. Nora, behind him, said, "You did a better job on that than my father did when he built it." Cal said, "I could see where it had failed. Easier to fix something right when you know what went wrong the first time." He moved on down the fence line. Nora went back to the garden. She thought about what he had said for the rest of the morning. She thought it was possible he was talking about the fence. She thought it was also possible he was not only talking about the fence. She thought she was possibly becoming someone who read too much into things, which was what happened when you spent 14 months primarily in your own company. She thought about him asking after a family named Ashby 4 years ago, in a town they had not yet reached. She pulled up dead plants and put them in the cart, and did not come to any conclusions. Silas Pruitt did not threaten. He arranged. Within the space of a week, the feed merchant who had been extending informal credit to the Ashby household for 2 years suddenly required payment in advance. The woman who had been buying Nora's mending work discovered she had less need for it than previously. The doctor who made occasional house calls to check on George's heart received what he later described to his wife as a suggestion that his time might be better spent on patients with more promising outcomes. None of it was illegal. All of it was Pruitt. Cal identified the pattern before Nora put a name to it. He had seen this kind of pressure before. Not from bankers and land office managers, but from officers who had needed soldiers to break without issuing a direct order to do so. He knew what systematic attrition looked like. He knew the shape of it. He told Nora on a morning when she came out to find him working on the north fence and looking like a man who had been deciding something. He told her in 4 sentences, flat and factual. "He is not going to rush you. He is going to dry you out. Make it so staying costs more than leaving. Then he will offer you a fair price and let you think it was your idea." Nora said, "I know. What do you want to do about it?" She looked at him. Most people, when they identified a problem she was having, told her what she should do about it. Cal had asked her what she wanted to do. It was a small distinction, and it was not small at all. "I want to outlast him," she said. "All right," Cal said. He went back to the fence. It was 2 days after this conversation that he arrived at the property, limping. He would not have said he was limping. He would have said he was walking, because to his way of thinking, the distinction between the two had been erased by time and adaptation. But Nora saw it immediately. She saw the compensation in his right hip, the slight adjustment of weight and angle that spoke of a man who had been managing a chronic pain for years and had organized his entire body around accommodating it. She said nothing for 3 hours. She watched him work. She noted the way he moved. She ran through what she knew, which was considerable given 14 months of close study of her own deteriorating body, and several years before that of self-directed reading in her father's medical books. In the late afternoon, she said, "Sit down." He said, "I am fine." "I know you are. Sit down anyway." He sat on the porch steps. Nora knelt beside him without asking permission, and put her hands on his right hip, finding the specific point of compression with the clinical efficiency of someone who had read about this in 3 separate texts and had practiced variations of it on herself when her own body provided the material. It took 4 minutes. When she finished and stood up, Cal sat very still, and then he moved experimentally, testing, the way a man tests something he does not believe will have changed. The chronic, dull ache that had been his companion since a piece of shrapnel grazed his hip at Chancellorsville in 1863, the thing the Army surgeons had told him was permanent, the thing he had built his entire physical life around accommodating, was gone. Not managed. Gone. He looked at her. She was already packing the small kit back into her bag with the same matter-of-fact manner she might have used to put away a hammer after driving a nail. "That should hold for a while," she said. "It will come back, but I can show you how to manage it yourself." "Where did you learn that?" "Books, mostly, and my own body. I have had considerable practice." A long silence settled between them. That is not something most people know how to do, Cal said. No, Nora said. It is not. She did not explain further. He did not push. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, and was somewhere in between. Deputy Webb, who happened to be passing on the road at that moment, would later tell his wife that Bridger had been looking at the Ashby girl like a man who had just found something he had not known he was looking for. That night, Cal rode out to the edge of the Sinclair lot, 11 months vacant, and looked at it for a long time in the dark. He had an offer in to the widow who held the deed. He was waiting for a response. He stood at the boundary of the lot and thought about the offer, and the deed restriction he had attached to it, and the reason he had attached it, and whether that reason had changed in the past 2 weeks. He decided that it had. He decided that the thing it had changed into was something he did not yet have language for, and that the lack of language did not change the fact of it. He rode home, and he did not sleep well. And in the morning he went back to the Ashby property and worked the fence. George Ashby came out onto the porch that afternoon for the first time in a week. He moved slowly, with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned to conserve what he had. He settled into the chair that Nora had put there for him, in the patch of sun that lasted longest on the south side of the porch, and he watched Cal work on the fence for a while without speaking. Cal worked. He did not acknowledge being watched, which George found in an odd way respectful. After a while, George said, "You do good work." "Thank you," Cal said. "You knew someone," George said. "Before, someone who told you about this place." Cal paused. He set down the tool he was holding. He turned and looked at George with the direct gray-blue gaze that his daughter had described in the privacy of her journal as the only gaze in Harlan's Crossing that did not contain an apology. "Yes, sir," Cal said. George nodded. He did not ask who. He sat in his patch of sun and closed his eyes and let the thin October warmth do what it could. And after a while, Cal picked up his tool and went back to work. And neither of them said anything more about it. But that evening, when Nora came to sit with her father before supper, George looked at her for a long moment with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he had made a decision that cost him something. "I wrote a letter," he said, "about 1.5 years ago, to a man I heard of from a fellow who was at Chancellorsville." He paused. "I told him about you, about what the doctor in Denver said." Nora went very still. "I did not ask him for anything," George said quickly. "I did not know what I was asking. I just needed to tell someone who was not going to look at you the way people here look at you. Someone who could hear it without it breaking them." He looked at his hands. "I think," he said slowly, "he may have come." Nora did not say anything for a long time. Through the window she could see the fence line, straight and solid in the last of the afternoon light. "Why did you not tell me?" she said. "Because I did not know if it would amount to anything, and because I was afraid you would not let it." She sat with that for a while. Her father's breathing was careful and deliberate beside her, the sound of a man managing a difficult situation with the tools he had. "Go to sleep, Papa," she said finally. She went into the kitchen and stood at the window for a long time after that. The fire started in the northeast corner of the storage shed at some point between midnight and 2 in the morning. It burned clean and fast, the way a fire burns when it has been helped along. And by the time Nora woke to the smell of it and got outside, the shed was gone. The house was untouched. There were no witnesses. There was no proof of anything. Cal arrived at dawn. He had seen the smoke from his trail north and had turned back. He found Nora sitting on the frozen ground in front of the ruins, not crying, just looking at what remained with the same clinical attention she brought to everything. George was on the porch, a blanket around his shoulders, his face the color of old plaster. Cal knelt down beside Nora. Not in front of her, beside her. He looked at what was left. After a while he said, "Damp ash on the north side, dry on the south." "Fire started from outside," Nora said. "Yes. Pruitt, Most likely. Another silence. The ruins steamed faintly in the cold air. The shed had contained their winter stores, most of them. 2 months of preserved food, feed for the animals, lamp oil, a season's worth of careful preparation now reduced to ash and char. Nora stood up. "We need a list," she said. "What we lost and what we still have." Cal stood. "I will get paper." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Cal wrote the list because Nora's hands were not steady, which she acknowledged once and did not mention again. They went through everything methodically, category by category, and then they went through what options remained. And then they began to build a plan from the available materials, which was not much but was not nothing. George sat in his chair by the window and watched his daughter work across the table from the mountain man with the gray-blue eyes. And his expression was complicated in a way that had several layers to it. There was grief in it. There was the particular grief of watching someone you love being tested past what they should have to endure. But underneath that, quieter and more durable, there was something else. He was watching his daughter come alive, not figuratively, not as a manner of speaking. She was sitting forward in her chair. Her voice was precise and purposeful. She was arguing a point about the feed situation with a confidence he had not heard from her since the diagnosis, and the man across the table was arguing back, not managing her, not softening his assessments for her benefit, just engaging with her as an equal in the specific problem they were trying to solve together. George closed his eyes. He breathed carefully, the way his damaged heart required. He let himself, just for a moment, feel something that was not grief. The plan they arrived at was not elegant, but it was workable. Cal knew a family 15 miles east who had surplus feed they would sell at a fair price. Nora had cash set aside from the summer's mending work, enough to cover the immediate gap if they were careful. The winter stores could be rebuilt partially if they started soon. And the Sinclair lot, Cal said, looking at the table rather than at Nora, was likely to be settled within the week. He said it as a practical piece of information, relevant to the overall situation. He did not look up when he said it. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You knew about the lot, before Pruitt told me." "Yes." "You were going to tell me." He met her eyes then. "I was trying to work out how." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the list. "The feed," she said. "Can we go today?" They went that afternoon, all 3 of them in the wagon, which was the first time George had left the property in 3 weeks, and which he did not complain about once, even over the rough road, even in the cold. They came back with enough feed to last 6 weeks and a plan for the rest. And when they pulled up to the house in the early dark and Cal helped George down from the wagon with the matter-of-fact care of a man who had decided this was part of what he was there to do, George gripped his arm for a moment and said nothing, and Cal said nothing either. That evening, after her father was in bed, Nora came out to the porch where Cal was sitting in the last of the cold. She sat down on the far end of the steps. After a while she said, "My father wrote to you about me." "Yes." "He told you I was dying." "Yes." "And you came anyway." Cal was quiet for a moment. The night was very clear, the kind of clear that came after cold fronts moved through and the stars were sharp and numerous above the mountains. "I came to fix the fence," he said. "That was what I told myself. And then I met you." He said it simply, without weight or decoration, the way he said most things. Nora sat with it. An owl called from somewhere in the dark pines at the edge of the property. The ruins of the shed were a dark shape against the darker ground. "I found the deed restriction," she said. "In Pruitt's description, it sounded like you were buying it to turn it over to the railroad. I almost believed him." "I know. But you built a wall into the deed that specifically prevents that." "Yes. So you were protecting us, without asking, without telling." "I did not know how to ask." I did not know what I was yet in this situation, and so I tried to do the useful thing from the outside. Nora looked at the fence post on the north side, straight and solid in the starlight. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said, "I know that now." The owl called again. Nora pulled her coat tighter. She was cold and her chest ached with the particular dull pressure that had become the baseline of her existence, and she was sitting in the dark on her porch steps, with a man who had ridden to a town he had never been to, looking for a family he had never met, and had fixed the fence before she came home, and had not once looked at her, like she was already somewhere else. "Tell me something true," she said. "Not about the lot or the letter. Something else." He thought about it for a moment. "I have not wanted to be anywhere in 4 years," he said. "Until about 3 weeks ago." She did not answer that. She sat with it instead. After a while she went inside and he rode north in the dark, and neither of them said good night. Day 17. The construction work was largely finished and Cal had been finding reasons to keep coming back. Small things, legitimate maintenance, and neither of them was pretending any longer that these were the reasons. Nora was on the porch in the thin October sun reading one of her father's medical texts on pulmonary conditions, which was the kind of reading she did not do in front of people because of how they reacted to it. Cal was doing something near the fence. The afternoon was quiet. The mountains to the north were developing a line of gray along their upper slopes that meant snow within a week. The cough came without warning, as it usually did. This was a bad one, lasting 4 minutes by the internal count she always kept, leaving her shaking in the aftermath with her handkerchief pressed to her mouth and her eyes closed and her whole body arranged around the single task of breathing. When she opened her eyes, Cal was there. He had moved to the porch without her hearing him. He was not standing over her. He was sitting on the far end of the steps, near enough to be present, not close enough to crowd. He was not offering water. He was not asking if she was all right. He was not doing the thing she dreaded more than the coughing itself, which was looking at her with the expression that was already grieving. He picked up the medical book that had slid off her lap and handed it back. Then he said, "You want to keep reading, or you want to be left alone?" She looked at him. "What I want," she said slowly, "is for someone to sit here for a while, without looking at me, like they are rehearsing for my funeral." "I can do that," Cal said. And he did. He sat on the steps and looked at the yard, and after a while he asked what the book was about, and she told him, and they talked about medicine for 45 minutes with the easy precision of two people who had found an unexpected shared language. He knew more than she expected, from army surgeons and field necessity, and his questions were specific and intelligent, and at no point in 45 minutes did he look at her the way people looked at her. He looked at her the way you look at a person. It was the first real intimacy between them, being known even partially without being pitied, and it arrived with the quiet shock of something you had been wanting, without knowing you had been wanting it. The following morning she found the bird on the porch railing. She almost missed it in the gray early light. A small thing, 4 inches from beak to tail, carved from a piece of light-colored wood she could not identify. She picked it up and turned it in her hands, and it was a meadowlark. Every feather placed with meticulous care, the wing position caught at the exact moment between folded and open, the specific attitude of a bird that was deciding whether to fly. There was no note. She stood there for a long moment, holding it. She had mentioned meadowlarks once in passing 2 weeks ago. She had said, in the context of something else entirely, that the sound of meadowlarks in the morning reminded her of Tennessee, and she had said it as a small aside, a parenthetical, the kind of remark that people let go past without retaining. He had not let it go past. He had been listening before she knew he was listening. She brought the bird inside and set it on the windowsill where the morning light would reach it. She went about her day. When Cal arrived, she did not mention the bird, and he did not mention it either, and somehow this was the right thing, to let it exist without explanation, because some things are diminished by being named. Later that afternoon, Cal used his knife to do some trim work on the replacement frame they were building where the shed had been. It was an old knife, bone-handled, worn smooth from years of use, but maintained with the same careful attention he gave to everything he owned. Nora asked, because she had been wondering, "Where did you get that?" "Made it," he said. "Before the war. I was 16. It was one of the few things he had told her about before the war. She recognized it as such and did not push. But she turned it over in her mind later, 16 years old, and making a knife that was still in use 14 years later. And she thought that told you something about a person, about what they built and how they built it, and what they expected to last. That evening, George called Nora to his chair by the window. He looked at her with the careful eyes of a father who had been thinking about something for a while. "He is a good man," George said. "I know, Papa. I did not tell him to stay. When I wrote the letter, I did not tell him to come here and do any of this. I just told him about you." Nora sat on the footstool beside his chair, the way she had sat since she was small. "Why?" she said. "Why did you need to tell a stranger?" George looked at his hands. "Because every person in this town, when they look at you, they see the end. I see it too. I cannot help seeing it, because you are my daughter, and I have been watching you for 22 years, and I know your face better than my own, and I needed someone in the world who could look at you and see the beginning, even if it was only me telling a stranger about you, even if it was only a letter going out into the dark. I needed someone in the world to know that you were here and that you were worth knowing." Nora pressed her lips together. She looked at the window where the meadowlark sat on the sill catching the last of the evening light. "He knows," she said quietly. "I think he does," George said. She sat with her father until he fell asleep. And then she went to the kitchen table and opened the journal and wrote, in full for the first time in weeks, everything she was actually thinking, without clinical language, without the detachment of a scientist recording data. She wrote until her hand hurt. Then she closed the book and went to bed. Outside, somewhere in the dark north, a man was sleeping in a cabin he had built with his own hands, 11 miles from the town where a woman was learning, slowly and against considerable resistance, how to let herself want something. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Nora went to the land office. She did not tell Cal she was going. She went in the morning while he was working the fence line, and she walked the half-mile to town with the deliberate pace of a woman who had something to accomplish and was not going to be slowed by her own lungs. Pruitt received her with his characteristic pleasant warmth. He offered her a chair. He asked after her father. He provided the 30-day extension on the tax notice with no hesitation whatsoever, signing the paperwork with the easy pen of a man who was not worried. She noticed this. She noticed the ease of it. He was not worried because he had something else. He offered it as she was standing to leave, in the tone of a man making an offhand observation. "Oh, I did wonder if you knew about the Sinclair lot. Your Mr. Bridger has been trying to buy it these past 2 months. Made the widow a fair offer. She is considering." He paused just long enough. "Funny thing is, that lot combined with what you hold would create a parcel the railroad would pay quite a lot for. I imagine Mr. Bridger knows that coming from Ohio. Mining and railroad men out of Ohio often have connections they do not advertise." He smiled. "Just thought you should know, in case it informed any decisions you are making about who to trust." He tipped his head in a small gesture of courtesy. She walked out. She walked the half-mile home with Pruitt's words rearranging themselves in her mind into shapes she did not want. She had known, abstractly, that Cal had been inquiring about the Sinclair lot. He had mentioned it. She had not thought about what it would look like from the outside. From the outside, assembled by a man with Pruitt's particular skill for assembly, it looked like this. A stranger appears, performs useful labor, buys adjacent property, and creates a combined parcel with a considerable railroad value. She knew in the part of her that had learned to be honest with itself that this was not who Cal was. She had watched him for 3 weeks. She had heard him talk about the war in the quiet, careful way of a man who had counted every cost and was still counting. She had felt his hands on her journal's spine when he handled it with more care than he handled his tools. But knowing something and believing it were not the same thing, and fear was faster than knowledge, and she had been afraid for such a long time. Cal was working the fence when she arrived. She watched him from the gate for a moment. Then she walked to where he was, and she said, "Why are you trying to buy the Sinclair lot?" He turned around. The pause was not a pause of deception. She would know later that it was a pause of a man trying to explain something he had only recently understood himself. He said, "Protection. If Pruitt gets that lot, he applies pressure from two sides. If I hold it, he cannot." "With your money?" "Yes." "Did my father write to you?" A longer pause. "Yes." The sound of something cracking was not always loud. Sometimes it was nearly silent, barely a seam giving way, and yet everything that depended on that seam shifted. She said, "He wrote to you about me, and you came, and you have been fixing things. The fence, the roof, the lot. All of it arranged, all of it managed." Her voice was even. It was more frightening than shouting. "Was there a price attached? Or is this pity? Is that what this has been?" "It is not pity." "Then what is it?" He said, "I do not know what it is anymore. It started as something I could name, and then it stopped being that. I came because of the letter, and I thought I would fix something useful and leave. And then I did not leave, and I do not want to leave. And I do not know how to say that in a way that does not sound like the thing you are most afraid of hearing." "Like pity," she said. "Like something more than that, which might be the thing you are actually afraid of." Her chin came up. "Get off my property," she said. He went. She stood in the yard for a while after he was gone. The fence line was straight and solid. The porch railing had been repaired 2 weeks ago. The shed framework was half built where the ruins had been. Everywhere she looked there was evidence of someone who had shown up and done the work and not asked for credit. She went inside. She did not open the journal. On the second day of his absence, she worked harder than she had in months, driven by a cold fury that was, she recognized with the clinical part of herself, the most alive she had felt in a long time. This did not make her feel better. It made her feel complicated. On the second night, she had the worst coughing episode in a month. She sat on the floor of her bedroom with her back against the bed, the handkerchief in her hand, and she looked at the windowsill where the meadowlark stood catching the moonlight. She did not throw it away. She noticed, with the part of her that noticed things, that she did not throw it away. On the third day, she went to see Ruth Calloway. Ruth listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not her usual mode, but which she employed when she understood the situation required it. When Nora finished, Ruth poured tea and set a cup in front of her and said, "The man came because your father wrote to him. That is true. You think that means he stayed for the same reason. Did he not? Nora, I have watched Callum Bridger pass through this town for 4 years. He has never stayed in one place longer than an afternoon. He has been here 3 weeks. Silence. "The question you are actually asking," Ruth said, "is whether someone can start something for one reason and end up somewhere different. You know the answer to that. You know it because the same thing happened to you." Nora left without answering, but she did not go home. She went to the county clerk's office, not Pruitt's land office, the county clerk's, and she asked to see the filing on the Sinclair lot inquiry. What she found was not what Pruitt had implied. Cal's offer to the Sinclair widow was below market value, because he was making the offer directly with no broker's fee, and it contained a deed restriction, handwritten and filed properly, specifying that the lot could not be sold to any railroad or railroad-affiliated entity for 20 years. He was not buying it to combine with the Ashby property for a railroad sale. He was buying it specifically to prevent that. The restriction was the first thing in the document. He had put it first. Pruitt had known this. Pruitt had described the situation in a way that was technically accurate and carefully misleading, and she had been afraid enough to believe the misleading version over what she knew about the man. She sat in the county clerk's office for a long time. Then she went to find Cal. He was at the livery, saddling his horse, not dramatically, not with the theatrical air of someone making a point about departure. He was simply doing what he had always done when staying somewhere became more complicated than he knew how to manage, which was the thing he had done since the war ended, and he had ridden away from Ohio and everything in it that hurt. He was leaving because it was the move he knew how to make. Nora walked up to him. She had the journal with her. He saw her coming, and he stopped what he was doing, and he stood very still, which was his version of waiting. She said, "I found the deed restriction, the railroad clause. Pruitt described your offer in a way that left it out." He said nothing. "He told me half the truth and left me the other half to fill in myself. And I filled it in with the wrong thing because I was frightened." She met his eyes. "That is what I owe you an apology for. Not for being angry, for choosing fear over what I actually knew about you." She held out the journal. He looked at it. "That is everything," she said. 14 months of records. Every symptom and every treatment and everything I have observed about what is happening in my own body. I have shown it to no one, not my father, not the doctors. This is not a diary. It is the most private thing I own, and I am handing it to you because it is the only way I know to say that I am done managing what you see when you look at me." Her voice did not shake. She had practiced being steady under difficult circumstances, and it was one of the things she did well. "You do not have to stay. But if you do, I want it to be because you know what you are staying for. All of it. Not the version that is easier to look at." Cal took the journal. He did not open it. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and she understood that he understood what it meant. He said quietly, "I am not going anywhere." He set the journal on the fence rail between them. He did not hand it back. He left it there, available to her, not taken from her. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why I came. All of it." She said, "I know. Tell me." He told her, standing at the fence rail of the livery in the cold afternoon light. And she listened without interrupting, which was what she gave people she trusted. He had been a sharpshooter at Chancellorsville. He told her what that meant, what the particular weight of that work was, the choosing of positions and angles, the precision that was required, and the cost that precision carried. He told her about a morning in May of 1863, when he had held a position because the order was to hold it, and 2 men in the advance had been killed because of that position, and one of them was a young corporal from Tennessee named James Ashby. Nora closed her eyes. He kept talking. After the war, he had done what he always did, which was account for things. He tracked down the families of the men whose names were on his personal ledger, which was not a written ledger, which was a ledger he carried in the part of himself that had no off switch. He found that James's father was still living in Tennessee and then in Colorado. He found that James had a younger sister who had come west with her father and who was sick. He found out everything James had told him about her, which was that she was the stubbornest person he had ever met and the funniest, and that she read medical books in secret, and that she wanted to do something important someday, and he was looking forward to seeing what it was. He did not come to make anything right. He came because the person James had described was still alive and was apparently exactly the person James had described, and he could not stay away from that. He did not have a clean explanation for it. He was not going to offer one that was not true. Nora opened her eyes. She looked at the fence post on the north side of the property, the first thing he had ever fixed for her, straight and solid in the afternoon light. "He talked about me," she said, "every day." "What did he say?" He said you were the stubbornest person he had ever met and the funniest, and that you were going to do something important someday, and he was looking forward to seeing what it was. She looked at the fence post for a long time. He did not get to see it, she said. No. A long silence. The kind of silence that has weight. Is that why you stayed? She asked. For James? It is why I came, Cal said. It stopped being why I stayed about a week in. I stayed because of you. Not because of him, and not because of your father's letter, and not because of the lot or the fence or the roof, because of you. Yes. When they walked back toward the Ashby house, Cal took the knife from his belt and set it on the porch rail when they arrived. He did not make a production of it. He just set it down. Nora looked at it. He said, I carry that everywhere. 16 years. I have never set it down somewhere I was not planning to pick it up again. He went inside to talk to her father. The knife stayed on the rail. She stood on the porch looking at it for a while. A knife made by a 16-year-old boy, maintained for 16 years, set down on a porch railing in Colorado in 1873. She went inside. The real conversation happened 2 days later at the mended fence post in the last of the afternoon light. It was the first truly cold day of autumn, the kind of cold that announced itself with a smell like iron, and the particular quality of light that meant the mountains had decided winter was no longer theoretical. They had walked the fence line together to check Cal's work from the previous week, and they had stopped here at the North Post without discussing it. Cal said, looking at the post, I should have told you about the letter when you asked why I was here. I kept it because I did not know how to explain that what had started as one thing had become something else, and I did not want you to think the something else was charity. I know what charity looks like to you. I know you cannot stand it. I should have told you the truth and let you decide what to do with it. Nora was quiet for a moment. The thing that hurt was not that you knew about me before we met, she said. It was not the letter or the lot. She looked at the mountains. For the first time in 14 months, I had decided there was someone who saw me. Not the sickness, not the tragedy. Me. And then I thought I was wrong. That it was all management. That I was a problem you had come to solve. She looked at him directly. Being a problem to be solved is almost worse than being invisible, because at least invisible does not get your hopes up. He held her gaze. I will not manage you, he said. I will not make decisions about what you should or should not know about your own situation. When something affects you, I will tell you, even when it is hard to explain. I will ask before I assume, she said, and I will tell you when I am frightened instead of pushing you away to avoid it. A pause. I cannot promise I will do it well. Neither can I, Cal said. It was the most honest thing two people had said to each other in this story, and they both knew it. They stood at the fence post for a while without speaking. The sun was going down behind the mountains, and the first stars were beginning to show in the eastern sky, faint and cold and very far. Cal said, looking at the mended post, I want to stay here, not to fix things, to be here. Nora said, You know what here means. You have read the journal. I know what here means. It might not be long, Cal. I know that too. And you still. Every day you are here is a day that exists, he said. That does not stop being true because there might be fewer of them than either of us wants. A long silence. Ask me properly, Nora said. He turned to look at her. Nora Ashby. Will you let me stay? She considered this for a moment with the precision she brought to everything. That is not much of a proposal. I know. I am not good at this. Ask me anyway. Will you marry me? She looked at him for a moment. The cold air moved between them. The mountains stood in the darkening west, patient and enormous and indifferent to all human arrangements, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about mountains. "Yes," she said, "I will." He did not sweep her into his arms. He did not say anything else right away. He turned back to the fence post and looked at his own work for a moment, the way a craftsman looks at something he has made, assessing it honestly. Then he said quietly, more to himself than to her, "All right, then." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, a dry sound that belonged to the person she was before the illness had decided to be the loudest thing about her. He looked at her when she laughed, and something in his face changed. Not dramatically, just settled, the way a foundation settles when it is properly seated, and the weight above it is finally resting on it the way it was meant to. They walked back to the house together in the early dark. The Sinclair lot deal closed in the first week of November. The deed restriction was filed at the county clerk's office on a Tuesday morning with the same quiet efficiency Cal brought to all his paperwork. Pruitt could no longer apply pressure from that side. The property tax arrears were addressed through an arrangement Cal proposed, and Nora accepted after 2 days of thinking it over. It was not a gift. It was a loan against the Sinclair lot's assessed value, secured with proper documentation, because Nora's pride was not an obstacle to be managed around but a fact of who she was, and it deserved an accurate foothold. Pruitt made one final move. He went to Deputy Webb with a suggestion, framed in the careful language of a man who had spent a career learning how to use legal structures for personal ends, that an out-of-state man acquiring adjacent properties under the territorial land acquisition statutes might be worth a second look. Webb came to Cal with this information, not bravely, not with any particular moral clarity. He came because telling Cal was the path of least resistance, and also happened to be the decent thing, which was the specific intersection where Webb was most reliable. Cal's paperwork was already in order. There was nothing to find. Pruitt left Harlan's Crossing 2 weeks after the Sinclair deal closed. He went to Denver, where there were larger transactions waiting for a man of his particular skills. He did not leave in disgrace. He did not leave defeated. He left because the numbers on the Harlan's Crossing situation had changed, and his time was valuable. This was how men like Pruitt left, not in confrontation, in calculation. Webb came to the wedding. He stood at the edge of the small gathering with the expression of a man who knew he had been weighed and found partially wanting and did not know what to do with that information. Nora was civil to him. She was not warm. Some things that should have happened differently left a mark on a person's regard that did not resolve cleanly, and this was one of them. And the story did not resolve it for him because the story was not about his resolution. They were married on a Thursday in November because Thursday was when Reverend Comstock came through Harlan's Crossing on his circuit, and neither Cal nor Nora had strong feelings about which day of the week things happened on, only that they happened. The ceremony was in the Ashby house because George could not be moved easily and no one questioned this. The gathering was small. George in his chair by the fire, wrapped in the good wool blanket. Ruth Calloway standing near the window with her arms folded, which was how she stood when she was trying not to show that she was moved. The Reverend with his book. Cal and Nora in the middle of the room. Before the ceremony, Nora was in the back room putting up her hair when she opened the drawer of the side table and found the letter. James had written it from camp in Virginia in the spring of 1863, 2 months before Chancellorsville. The paper had gone soft with handling. She had read it so many times the folds were wearing thin. He had written, "You are the best person I know, and I hope someone knows it besides me before long." She read it once more. She folded it and put it back in the drawer. She did not carry it with her into the ceremony. She did not need to. She carried what he had said, which was not the same as the paper, and was more durable. Cal's vow was not written down. He stood in the middle of the small room with the fire behind him, and George's careful breathing, and the snow beginning outside the window. And he said, "I am not going to make promises about the future I cannot keep. But I can tell you what is true right now. Right now, I want to be here. I want to be wherever you are. I want to know what you think about the things you are reading, and I want to hear you when the nights are bad. And I want to be the person you talk to when you find something funny at 8 in the morning that I will not understand until afternoon. That is what I am promising, to be here, for all of it. Nora's vow. I spent 14 months trying to make dying look manageable. You are the first person who made me want to make living look manageable instead. I promise to let you see the parts that are not manageable. I promise to ask for help before I push you away. And I promise to tell you about the Pacific Ocean until you agree to take me there. Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and turned briefly toward the window. George said nothing. He sat in his chair by the fire and breathed his careful breath, and held himself together through the force of a father's will. When the Reverend pronounced them married, and Cal leaned down and kissed her, with the particular thoroughness of a man who had been careful about a great many things for a great many years, and had made a deliberate decision to stop being careful about this one, Ruth Calloway stopped trying to be composed. After the ceremony, Ruth took Nora's hands in both of hers and was quiet for a moment, which was rare for Ruth. Then she said, "Your brother would have liked him." Nora said, "I know." 8 months later, in the late spring of 1874, the cabin 11 miles north of Harlan's Crossing held two people in the early morning light. Nora was at the table. Her journal was open. She was writing a letter to a doctor in Denver she had been corresponding with for 3 months. A man who was apparently the only physician in the territory who read German medical literature and had therefore encountered her clinical observations about her own case with something approaching genuine professional interest. The correspondence had started as a single cautious inquiry. It had become something else. On the windowsill, where the morning light came through the single east-facing glass, a carved meadowlark stood with its wings caught between folded and open. Cal came in from outside with firewood and set it down without interrupting her. He poured coffee. He set a cup beside her hand without comment. He sat across the table with his own cup and opened the surveying manual he had been working through slowly all winter, teaching himself the practice of land measurement because it seemed useful, and he liked understanding how things worked. They read and wrote in the morning light. Nora coughed. It was not a good cough. She paused, she waited it out, she wiped her mouth, she continued writing. Cal did not look up from his book. He moved his chair 6 inches closer to hers. He did not make a production of it. She finished her paragraph. She put her hand flat on the table between them. He put his hand over hers. Outside, in the pines that stood thick and dark around the clearing, a meadowlark started up. The first one of the season, trying its voice against the spring air, finding it strong enough. Neither of them said anything about it. They did not need to. George Ashby was living at Ruth Calloway's boarding house in town, where the cooking was better than anything he had managed on his own, and the company, he admitted, was considerably better too. He had sold the town lot to a young couple from Kansas at a fair price of his own setting, and he visited the cabin when the road permitted. And on those visits he sat in the chair by the window and watched his daughter move through her kitchen and listened to her argue with her husband about the merits of various medical theories, and laughed at things she said that she had not intended as jokes. And he thought, she is here. She is here, and she is alive, and she is known. The Pacific Ocean was still waiting. They had discussed it. Cal had looked at the maps. The surveying manual had information about elevations and pass conditions that was relevant to the question of when such a journey could be made. Nora had written to a doctor in San Francisco about what the coastal climate might do for pulmonary conditions, and the doctor had written back with a cautious and interested response. It was not a plan yet. It was a direction, which was, Nora had written in her journal the night that letter arrived, enough. A direction was enough. A direction was more than she had had 14 months ago. Standing at the window of the Mercantile with a ruined handkerchief in her pocket, and a notice from the land office, and the particular loneliness of a person that a town had already begun to mourn. That was before a man with gray-blue eyes had picked up a sack of flour without looking at her, and said two words that had nothing to do with pity. She had spent 14 months learning to fold the bad things up small and put them away. She had spent the last 8 months learning something harder and more valuable, which was how to put the good things out where the light could reach them, on windowsills and porch railings, in the hands of someone who would hold them carefully. The meadowlark in the pines sang on. Cal's hand was warm over hers. Outside the window, the mountains stood where they had always stood, and the spring was moving through them in the way spring always moved, unhurried and inexorable, indifferent to the arrangements of people but present for all of them. Nora picked up her pen. She continued her letter. She was, in the specific and quiet way available to a woman in 1874 Colorado who could not enroll in any medical school, and could not hold any official position, and could not put her name to any formal work, becoming someone whose knowledge was beginning to reach past her own front door. The Denver doctor was reading her observations. He was citing them in his own correspondence. Her name was in letters she would never see, attached to things she had discovered in the laboratory of her own body, which had been an inconvenient laboratory but a thorough one. What she was building would outlast the building of it. She did not say this out loud because she did not need to. She knew it. Cal knew it. George knew it in his chair at Ruth's boarding house, reading the newspaper by the morning light. James had known it first. He had been the one to say it, in a letter written in the spring of 1863 in a camp in Virginia, to a younger sister who read medical books in secret and wanted to do something important someday. He had been right about her. He had been right about everything, in the end, including the part about someone knowing it besides him. The morning light moved across the table. The meadowlark called once more, settling into its spring morning business, deciding the world was suitable for the season's first song. Neither of them said anything about it. They did not need to. They were here. They were together. The day was beginning, which was the only thing a day could do, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and every ordinary moment of it was the thing he had promised and she had chosen, and they were building it together, one careful day at a time for however long the days ran, which was longer than anyone had told them to expect, which was, in the end, exactly the point.